When we have an active shooter event with critical patients, or even sometimes when we just have critical trauma, we use the phrase load and go. Load and go, which if you're on the EMS side, has a specific meaning to you. But does it have the same meaning to law enforcement, or are we talking about two different things? That's today's topic. Stick around. Welcome to the Active Shooter Incident Management Podcast. My name is Bill Godfrey, your podcast host. I am joined today by two of our other instructors here at the National Center for Integrated Emergency Response. Terry Nichols, back in the house. Terry, good to have you here.
Glad to be here, Bill.
And I'm joined by Joe Ferrara. Always good to have you, Joe.
Happy to be here, Bill.
And he sounds thrilled, doesn't he, folks? Okay, so today's topic, we're going to talk about load and go. Now, in fairness, I do want to share with the audience that this actually came up over lunch, and we got into a very interesting discussion, and I wish we'd actually been recording that discussion. And so we said, hey, this is a really good topic for our podcast today. So, Terry, you brought up a very interesting scenario. So let's go ahead and start with that as our framing of this and take it from there.
Sure, let's try to recreate magic from our earlier conversation. Thanks for setting me up for that. So in an active shooter event, we have one. Law enforcement they do great things. They go down range, then stop the killing. What they find out is the killing's already stopped. They find 3 casualties, 3 survivors that are injured, and 1 deceased with a gun next to them and a bullet wound to the head, obviously a suicide by all appearances. They're ready for ambulances. They're like, this is warm zone, cold zone, call it what you want to call it, but I need ambulances. So they call back to maybe tactical's already stood up, maybe tactical's not stood up, but they saw ambulances driving behind them, so they know they're there. So they say, roll me an ambulance down, because they see 3 bodies on the ground on the cement, and they want to get them to definitive care. How can we make that happen? That was a fundamental question.
And it's a very good question. It's a very good question, and it has some interesting twist to it. So, Joe, why don't you pick it up from there? So you and I actually worked in ambulance together for quite a few years. That may have been decades ago. But you're on a rig, and you get told to move up to this location. What are some of the challenges as you roll in with your ambulance and you've got the 3 patients?
Sure. So law enforcement is calling for us. Terry's sitting there going, I need an ambulance. I need an ambulance now. We get the call. We move down range. Certainly if law enforcement is calling for us, the whole scene safety thing, or, you said it might be a warm zone, might be even a cold zone by this point. So we're safe to move up. So we're working. There's all these patients. You're pressuring us as law enforcement to say, let's go, load and go. Let's get them out of here. I got to get them to the hospital. My feeling as a paramedic is, well, first of all, let me just get this out there because it's on the tip of my tongue. We're not just a ride to the hospital, and I think that's been a past thought process when it comes to EMS. There's a lot that has to go into that. And you said there's 3 bodies on the ground. There's 3 bodies on the cement, on the concrete. I've got to do some level of triage to decide, what acuity do we have here? You're thinking, okay, they're all down. They just need get them off my scene.
I threw a
get them to the hospital.
Tourniquet on 2 and a chest seal on 1, and I need them.
Need them gone.
They need definitive care.
You need them gone.
Yeah, right.
So what does that definitive care really mean? I mean, you're thinking in terms of hospital, and I know the universal definition of definitive care is that getting them to the trauma center, getting them to the hospital. But sometimes I think maybe law enforcement or even all emergency responders, we forget, what is that phase in between? EMS is there for a reason. EMS is there for a level of care that started with law enforcement, first responder. EMS comes into the role. They're doing triage. They're going to do some level of care to maintain the patient. And I think we get caught up with the phrase of, let's get them there as quick as possible. The Platinum 10 comes to mind, and Terry and I had this discussion too about, EMS really should be thinking about 10-minute on scene time as a maximum or as a benchmark. If we're going over 10 minutes and there's no practical reason, like the patient's entrapped or something or having difficulty getting to them, then we really should be thinking about getting to the hospital. But time. We know time is a killer, but we forget about what's going on during that time. Are they in the back of a patrol car and we're rushing to the hospital and they're still bleeding out and they got an airway problem and law enforcement, doesn't realize that? Or are they in the back of the ambulance with appropriate level of care, advanced life support, paramedic doing the job, And then sometimes law enforcement feels like, hey, these 3 patients, get them in that, pretty yellow or orange and white or red and white truck and take them to the hospital where they belong. Well, what's the paramedic thinking? Is the paramedic going to be able to take care of those 3 patients all at once? Or worse yet, hey, this guy's ready to go. Get him in your ambulance, get him out of here. I have an obligation to the other patients that are still on the scene. And I know I just unwrapped a whole bunch of different issues. Bill is over here looking at me like, oh my God, what did we do here with this discussion? But really, how many, to my law enforcement brother and sisters out there, how many of you have had that very thought when EMS shows up is like, just get them in the truck and get them out of here. What do you, what's all this magic potion you're doing here? Just go.
Before you respond, Bill, I'd just like to say this sounds much more complicated than my simple description of the situation.
Well, and I think that's kind of the point that I wanted to talk about is load and go. By and large, I think to law enforcement means, throw them in something that moves quickly and get them to definitive care to the hospital, the surgeon. But it is a little more complicated than that. Joe kind of alluded to this. We have EMS in this country for a reason. Now, in active shooter events, it doesn't always work the way that we want it to, and that's a different problem. If you system problem, we'll talk a little bit more about that. But when you say, "Hey, I've got 3 people on the concrete," I want them, pick them up and get them off my scene and get them gone. That's what I want. I want them gone from the scene. I want them on their way to the hospital. What you really want is them to survive.
Good point.
And here's the reality is not all gunshot wounds need surgery. Not all gunshot wounds get surgery. And even critical gunshot wounds that end up at a trauma center, they don't always do surgery immediately. Sometimes they're waiting 24, 48 hours to provide some blood, stabilize the patient before they ever go in and do surgical intervention. And so and I think Joe was right. We talk about very often the clock and time kills. And I think what we neglected to really clarify in that is that we're talking about how long it takes to get medical care to the patient's side, and then determine how urgent is this situation. What best serves this specific patient with the specific injury or injuries that they have. For example, you said 3 patients and you threw a tourniquet. I think you said a tourniquet on 1 or 2 tourniquets on and you did a chest seal. Okay, great. Well, did each patient just get shot 1 time? Have the tourniquets solved the problem, stop the bleeding? Have the tourniquets controlled the bleeding? That no longer is urgent. Now, the one that's shot in the chest, may well be considerably more urgent. But in the case of, Joe mentioned an airway problem, these are fixable things. And so the question is, do any of these patients have something that we need to fix right now? In our words of our dear friend Jeff Williams, it's a right now problem. And they're not going to survive a 3-minute trip to the hospital if we don't fix this. They're either going to bleed out, they're going to have airway compromise, whatever the case may be. We say as medics that if you're shot neck to navel, there's not a whole lot we can do. And that's true. But there are some things that we can do, and there are some things that can be fixed. There are some things that will absolutely produce a known fatal outcome. And in some cases, that is an avoidable fatality if they're provided that emergent treatment. But Joe also mentioned the other problem. You call for an ambulance to come up. Most ambulances, not all of them, but well over 90% of the ambulances operating in this country are operating with a crew of 2. Either 2 paramedics or a paramedic and EMT. One of them stays in the back with the patient and one of them's driving. So you've got a crew of 2 people that's just rolled up on 3 patients with gunshot wounds. There's a problem right off the bat. We don't have enough resources. Secondly, as Joe mentioned, in every state there's abandonment laws. You have a licensure and a duty to act. You can't leave the other patients without providing an equivalent level of medical care as we do that. And so there's all of these things that come up, and the simple answer is just load and go. Just load them up and go. Just load them up and go. Just load them up and go.
Get them off my scene.
Get them off my scene. And in many cases, that will have an okay outcome, because in many cases, patients don't have the kind of problems that produce fatal results in a few moments, but some do. And that's what EMS is there for, whether it's a gunshot wound, as we're talking about in this case, or heart attacks, which we've been taking care of for a long time. There are things that can be done to put that patient on a better path to survival. And so the subtlety of how EMS systems work is lost on most law enforcement, as it should be, because they don't live in that world.
We don't know what we don't know.
Right. And so when we talk about as simple as the one chest, let's say that the one patient was shot in the chest with chest seal, they're in bad shape and they need to go right now. Well, now I got a real problem, because one paramedic can't take care of a patient with that level of criticality. Somebody's got to drive the ambulance. So now are we putting the paramedic in the EMT, and we're taking a cop from the scene who's going to drive, and then we're going to leave the other two? So it gets complicated real fast, Terry.
Right. And then that's what it sounds like. And go back to what I said a minute ago. We don't know what we don't know. And what I hear both of you saying now is, okay, if I'm that officer downrange and I'm the one calling for the ambulance, and they show up and they get to work basically managing a CCP, they've been basically retasked. Their job is no longer just to load and go. They're now managing 3 patients and calling for more resources, like you referenced.
Mm-hmm. Correct.
We're light on resources. And then they can start prioritizing, triaging, and the other ambulances coming downrange can go transport. Is what I'm hearing. I think I'm hearing you say.
And that's spot on. And the question, which I don't know that this came out loud earlier, but you said, if this happens in the first 3 or 4 minutes, well, if we've skipped over the incident management component, so 3 or 4 minutes in, you call for the ambulance. Within 1 or 2 minutes, they come up. And we've skipped over all of the incident management that we would typically do: tactical, triage, transport, staging, a command post. That ambulance needs to call for more help. Who are they calling? They're going to call dispatch. They're going to try to raise other units that may or may not be there. They don't know which units are there, which units aren't. So when it comes to saving time, it's not just the time to get the medic to the patient's side, but it's also the time it takes to get the rest of that stuff stood up. And if it's not there when you need it, you've just cost yourself time.
Mm-hmm. So I think that adds the value of standardized, like the checklist. Standardized processes. Go with the process and do what we normally do. Yes, you may skip that initial step because you got a rescue task force, for lack of a better term, but it's an ambulance with a medic and a paramedic down there managing your CCP. You've got plenty of cops providing security, but don't forget all the other things that need to be done. Set tactical, set staging, do all these other things, because when the ambulance calls for more, another ambulance or 2 to come down range, because it's secure, we have security there, they know who to call, and a process is already in place. Like you just said, we're not skipping around, bouncing around, getting to where we've been historically in these situations where it's chaos. Did I hear that right?
Yeah, I think that's spot on. The other thing that I would add is, if the situation is such that I think that the law enforcement officers that are there at the sides of the patients feel like they're in a cold zone, then that changes the equation of how we have to provide security very dramatically. Now, I don't need to just have one ambulance go up. I can have the ambulance or a couple of ambulances. We can have the additional fire and EMS resources. They can all pile in. Now, there's still a management component. There's still a resource component. You still have 3 patients, potentially three critical patients, who may all need 3 ambulances to be transported. So there's still this scene management component, but it doesn't necessarily have to be done within the rescue task force concept if it's a cold zone. If it's not a cold zone, then I think the process has to prevail.
And I agree. And I think as a cop, as an officer, I would be more inclined to say it's still warm, not knowing. Yeah, I'm pretty sure, this is, but we talked earlier about domestic disturbance, where it's just 3 shot and a suicide, and it's at a house, and it's was an active shooter at one time. Sure, it was for about 5 seconds until everybody was shot.
Yeah,
and then it turned into just a static, crime scene, basically crime scene with some wounded folks. How do we treat that today, day in and day out? Well, a cold zone. More than likely, you've got enough officers there watching, setting external overwatch just because, and roll your resources in and do it. But more the active shooter, what we're talking about, the type of situations, the numbers will tell us traditionally it's not a harvest, a festival amount of casualties. It's typically much lower, but we need to have processes in place, and can I change gears just slightly?
Sure.
So another thing, and I've been reading up on a little bit myself, and that is we're officers. I'm not going to wait for an ambulance. I want them in a police car and go. And I know Philadelphia is one of the models that does this a lot. But from professional paramedic perspectives, how do you view this?
Joe, I'll let you hit this one first.
Okay. Well, I don't view it as a bad practice. Certainly it's working in that community in Philadelphia, but I think we have to drill down and peel back some layers as to why it works there. Is it we mention a lot of times, is it a system problem? Do they have enough ambulances and resources available? Maybe that's what drove them to look at that type of policy in their community. I mean, clearly there's an organized EMS system in Philadelphia, but is it robust enough to handle the call volume? Or are they encountering a number of scenes to where it's just not stable enough to bring fire and EMS directly into the scene, where law enforcement is being pressured? Maybe it was a riot. Maybe it was a situation that's going to turn into a riot. Law enforcement is standing around an injured casualty on the ground, and the crowd's starting to go, why aren't they doing anything?
I can see that.
Why are they just standing there while my loved one, while my friend, while my brother is bleeding to death?
Do something.
That's a problem. Do something. So I could see that community or circumstances in urban settings where they're driven to that. But I think that the leaders need to look at the overall, how did we get there? What system failures occurred, and how could we fix that? No, maybe there isn't an easy fix. Maybe they have to throw money at it. I don't know, but double your EMS system size, make the availability. EMS that is grown and based out of law enforcement happens in areas of this country for that reason too, as well. So those are just some examples.
And I think that's spot on. The question is why, and I think Joe kind of hit on it. There is an excessive delay in an ambulance getting there, either because one isn't available or because the scene isn't secure enough, whatever the case may be. Or the flip side of this, the security situation says we need to get out of here. We either have a riot that had already occurred, or if we stay here any longer, we're going to have a riot. So let's get out of Dodge. I think the other thing that
I think it's Philadelphia, not Dodge.
Okay.
Yeah.
You ever want to see a train derail? That's how that happens.
Yep.
That's
exactly
right off the track. I think the other thing that gets skipped over here very quickly is that Philadelphia commonly has a lot of vans that they use for transporting prisoners or arrestees. To me, they're paddy wagons. I don't know if that's the technical term or not.
We'll go with it today.
I'm sure it is not the correct term, but it is a van with an open floor deck area on the back. It's not the back of a patrol car. And so even you could still render some basic care. That's different than trying to do so in the backseat of a patrol car with a cage in it. There is no room to function, and most adults laying down on the rear seat can't lay down fully because they won't fit within the length of the doors. And so that can be an issue. The other challenges that occur during that transport phase is when you look at the actual study. So there's been, and this is what's so interesting, is there's been a whole bunch of studies on this, but they all cited and come from this one study that produced the data. Then there were two good studies that was done on that, and then the rest of them all worked from those studies. They interviewed and surveyed some of the patients that were transported in the back of the van, and they indicated that it was very painful. It was very scary because they were bouncing around and sliding all over the place. And that's not to say that if it saved their life, it would matter to them. I'm not implying that. But here's the other reality is when you look at the raw data, the difference in mortality survival, depending on which of these studies you look at and what they included and excluded, is about 0.5%. It was barely above the level of statistical significance. And the other reality is, how far are you away from a hospital in Philadelphia at any point in the downtown area? How far do you have to go? How many trauma centers do they have? What is the typical transport time in the back of these? And so it's kind of like we're comparing apples to gorillas. It's not even comparing two types of food. What goes on in that community and how they're solving their problem is working for them. It's their community. Mm-hmm. But to assume that that solution is going to magically transplant itself and work in your community, it's beyond foolishness.
And I agree. I've read some of those studies as well, and I agree with you. And some of the other content that came out of that would apply, I think, anywhere. It was from the healthcare providers. It was the doctors. It was saying like, concerned about weapons being introduced into the ER environment, not knowing what's coming, what's inbound, not knowing, breaking their processes. They have processes in place. When ambulance rolls up, they have a process in place on y'all. You know this far better than I do. So I'm speaking from a position of basic ignorance, but I do know there's processes. And the studies that interviewed these doctors and nurses and staff from ERs said these were some of our concerns. This is what that.
Well, they have no heads up.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, no one's called in with the patient information.
There's no nothing. All of a sudden they show up at the door and boom, they're faced with a penetrating trauma that they weren't ready for because they're working something else. So I agree with you. Just because it works for them, and there's some other cities around the nation they reference in these that are starting to look at these models. But to say that this is the simple model to go with, carte blanche, I don't think is the right move to do. It just scoop and go, as we're talking about, grab and go, for law enforcement to grab somebody and go. Why would, if that's the case, a traffic crash, okay, you have somebody got ejected out of a car, why don't you grab them, throw them in your car, and go to the hospital with them? What's different? Now, I want to make sure we differentiate. There's that word again. I mess one up every time. Harvest, Pulse, Aurora, the big ones. That Aurora, they did the best they could. There's a breakdown in the system, and they did the best they could. Harvest is a complete outlier. The sheer magnitude of that event. People were in Ubers, they were in cabs, they were in trucks, and Pulse, they're in trucks, and these kinds of things. So those kind of events are going to happen, right? But as a matter of routine, as your standard operating procedure, this is what you should do. I think as law enforcement, I think we ought to be very, very cautious and think very big picture before we decide we need to codify this and this is the way we're going to act.
Terry, I think you're right on the money, and I've said this before, and I stand by it. We have ambulances, we have EMS in this country for a reason. If you're concerned about active shooter response in your location and not having confidence that EMS is going to work and is going to be there, that's a system problem. And we ought to be having a discussion about that. You ought to be engaging in that dialogue. Don't you think, Joe?
Sure. And Terry, I know we've talked about this as well. Law enforcement, maybe we need to get together as fire EMS law enforcement and have some real good conversations about how the EMS system works. Because I think the average boots on the ground law enforcement officer, there's the ambulance, that's the way to the hospital for the patient that is on my scene. And I get that. Guy bleeding on concrete, put him in the pretty truck, go to hospital. And that's the limit of that because they have other responsibilities and other things to worry about. And the sooner they feel like they get that person out of their way, out of their scene, that's going to save their life. From the EMS perspective, from the paramedic side, there's a whole lot of steps that go in between I've arrived on scene and I've arrived at the hospital. It's not just that piece of it's a ride to the hospital. I mean, just look at simply some of the priorities. We talk about safety priority, we talk about priority of life, we talk about scene priorities, but paramedics are thinking before I even touch the patient, before I even deal with the airway, I've got scene safety, BSI, we've all heard that. I got mechanism of injury, what am I dealing with? And then I've got number of patients. And besides number of patients, now I need additional resources, yes or no. If I got one patient, I'm good. But in this example, we got 3 patients, I'm not good. I need more ambulances. So I'm working my list of priorities before I even say, okay, does he have an open airway? Is he breathing? What's his circulatory status? Is the bleeding controlled? All those things that I'm going to go through. I got a lot of stuff to do before I make that decision. Not only I'm leaving the scene now, I'm loading and going, so to speak. Where am I going? Where's my closest facility? And we need to add that word in. Where's the closest, most appropriate facility to take this person to? Any hospital may not be the right answer, and all hospitals are not created equal. There's community level hospitals, there's level 1 trauma centers, there's level 2 trauma centers. In fact, in this country, we go all the way down to level 5 as far as grading trauma centers. Some states only recognize level 1 and 2, but there's different grades and availabilities of different type of resources. That's what you have EMS for.
I think we as law enforcement need to get out of our head, and you said it best earlier, it's not Uber. You're not calling Uber to take these casualties to the hospital. And when the professionals get there, we have to recognize it's their scene now. Maybe not their scene.
Not
these
their
patients,
scene. Yeah.
These casualties are theirs. I'll get back on my gun. I'll start my investigation, whatever that case is. But the professionals are here.
Let them do their job.
Let them do their job. If it takes longer than you expect it to be, too bad, so sad. It's not your role anymore. You're not the professional in this world. They are. And just like we talked in one of our earlier podcasts that we did about breaching, we talked about partnering with our fire and EMS partners, especially fire, about breaking things, breaking into places, right? And this is another conversation that helps bridge that integration, and talking ahead of time is like, okay, if I call you to this scene, what should I expect from you? And you said, don't expect me just to throw them on a backboard and throw them
go.
Go. It's not, I may throw them in and put them in and start working them. And guess what? The wheels aren't moving for another 10 minutes.
Well, I would ask, how many law enforcement officers have had that conversation with their local EMS and fire about what are your priorities? What does happen when I call you and I need you on my scene?
It's just, I think it sounds like it's an education piece across the board, and especially on the law enforcement side about expectations. I know what I see. I know the outcome I want. And you brought it up where, well, I want them to live. I know immediately I want them off the ground because I know they're going to have a lot better chance of living if I get them off of there and get them somewhere else. But at the end of the day, I want them alive. And if I have professionals by their side, I'm getting them medical care. They're getting medical care if I get professionals.
We've got the same goals in mind.
Yeah.
Just how we get there is different.
And I think I would wrap that piece of this up by saying, look, if you're a law enforcement officer serving in the United States today and you don't have confidence or faith that your EMS system is going to be there when you need them and able to further survival of the patients, you do not need to invent something new. You need to fix the problem. If it's a perceived problem, then discussion should resolve it. But look, we all have been into communities training across this country where there are EMS systems that are not prepared. They haven't had these conversations with law enforcement. They haven't worked out the details. The teams have not trained together. There are problems. The solution is to fix the problem, not try to invent something new. We're seeing law enforcement officers be just literally drug out in the public square over bad decision making. What do you think is going to happen when you throw a patient in the back of a car and drive 90, 100, 110 miles an hour down the street, and that patient had a fixable airway problem and is a fatality, but it was a survivable injury. It was a survivable injury.
That's going to be a problem.
And that's going to be a problem. And so is the same of driving 100 miles an hour and getting T-boned and killed somebody else. Mm-hmm. You know, it's not to say that ambulances can't get into car accidents. They do. But we are providing medical care in the back of the ambulance during the transport phase. And not all trauma is created equal. Some of it is extremely urgent. Most of it isn't. It still needs to get taken care of in a timely fashion. But what we really need to do is get the trained medical responders to the patient's side as quickly as possible to determine what of these injuries do I need to mitigate right now, and then get them transported to the definitive care. Now, all that said, that's very different than we had a plan and the plan went to shit, and what are we going to do now? When you got lemons, you make lemonade. And the two that you named, Aurora, Pulse, horrible challenges on the integrated response and incident management side at both of those events. Mm-hmm. Pulse explicitly, it happened not 15 minutes from where we are sitting recording this right now. It wasn't a lack of ambulances, and yet the pickup truck that everybody saw on CNN transported more patients than the ambulances put together. It's because the system failed. The response plan failed. And so the people that were there, the officers that were there, made the decision. They had lemonades and they had lemons and they made lemonade. And God bless them for doing it, because they saved a lot of lives. And the question is, okay, in the aftermath, what do we learn from that? And how do we fix the problem? And it seems like a lot of people's answer is, well, we should just transport them in the back of a police pickup truck all the time, or the back of a police van all the time. And it just makes me want to, slap myself in the head. If that's all you've got left to save lives, then yes. But if that's part of your response plan on paper, what are you doing?
Yeah, there's much bigger problems.
Yeah.
If that is your plan, there's much bigger problems.
And the October 1 harvest in Vegas, that's a pure example of just an absolute, honest to goodness, mass casualty incident that completely overwhelmed the local jurisdictions and the local resources. And I actually think that they did a pretty phenomenal job of managing what they had.
Yeah, thank God that is an outlier.
Yes.
That is an outlier. It could happen again tonight.
It could.
Somewhere around the nation.
But three people laying on the concrete in front of the officer is not an outlier. And that's my concern.
It's also not a mass casualty.
And it's not a mass casualty. But are they looking at that as, hey, ambulance, come here, pick these up and get them off my scene? That becomes the problem. What is the expectation, and what is that officer's mindset on the role of EMS in that, and what we have to do? And as Bill has already said it's not about the time to the hospital. It's about the time to get the trained resources to the patient's side.
Yeah, agreed. I would acknowledge, though, Joe, if it's one of those where the only thing that's going to save them is the surgeon cutting them open as soon as they hit the door, that is about time to the hospital. But that's also one of those things that paramedics are trained to recognize when they see that.
Yep.
And to say, and
I'm not.
And to say, okay, this is a right now problem, and this one's got to go. This one's got to go by any means necessary. This one's got to go. So I think it's good for law enforcement to ask this question. It is a valid question. I'm 3 or 4 minutes in. I've got 3 patients here. My suspect is down. I need, and you use the phrase, I need an ambulance. And what I would say is, what you need is EMS. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I need medical resources.
You need the medics. Mm-hmm. You need the medical teams. Now, whether they show up in an ambulance or in a fire truck or on foot as part of an RTF with their own security detail, we need the medical people there.
Yeah, to let them start doing their job, making the decisions they make. Again, I'm looking at it from a very novice perspective. The best I can do is cyber tourniquet or chest seal. Or wound packing. That's the level of my skill that I'm capable of doing. But once you folks show up, the professionals show up, I'm out. I just know these people need to go to the hospital, and I need medical resources. And I think a lot of cops have this question. You know, as we go around the country, cops say, "Hey, why can't I just do this?" You can, okay, but understand, have a realistic expectation of what's going to occur when they get there. Don't just think they're going to throw them in the back of the ambulance and drive off. Don't have that in your mind, because when it doesn't happen, if that's your expectation when they get there and it doesn't happen, you're going to get frustrated, and it's going to lead to confusion. It's going to lead to all kinds of issues. That's why we need to train together ahead of time, know each other, know what to expect. So when you don't see them moving immediately, you understand why. The why behind it will help a lot.
Yeah, and a perfect illustration of that. Let's say that you've got 9 or 10 patients down. Well, 9 or 10 patients that have all been shot, there's a decent chance that at least one of those is going to be a right now patient. But how do you figure that out if you don't go through them?
Do the process.
You don't go through the process and triage them. You don't know which one's the right now problem. And that's the kind of the challenge of this. So I said it earlier, I'll say it again. If you're in a community where you know that you have an issue, or you don't have faith in your EMS system, then you need to fix that problem. You need to bring attention to it and fix that problem, because you don't need to invent police department transporting patients. They did that a lot of years ago, and for decades now we've had ambulances and organized EMS systems that have saved a lot of lives. And I that's not to say that we don't have challenges on this front. We do. We do. Almost every community that we go into where EMS is a separate, what they sometimes call a third service, but EMS is separate and standalone and does all the medical, and there's not any other cross-trained medical providers. I would say more than half of the time, those communities, they don't have a plan for who the medics are that are going downrange. That's a problem.
Yeah.
It's a problem we ought to be talking about now, in my opinion. Joe, what do you think?
I agree. And Terry, as you said it's not your wheelhouse. How about that stay in the lane mentality that we always talk about? Law enforcement, you got us to this point. Here's the patients. It's your scene. I get it. But when those medics arrive in that ambulance, you call for the proverbial ambulance, they've got a lane to be in, and they've got to deal with the patient. You've got a lane to be in moving forward from that point to maintain scene security, to maintain the crime scene, all that stuff law enforcement is going to do. And really, the medics, they got it from here. And as Bill's already said, if that's not working in your community, it's not just a simple matter of an understanding between law enforcement and fire and EMS, then it's a system problem. Deal with the system problem. Don't just apply, hey, I read a study about what happens over there in Philadelphia. They're throwing in the back of paddy wagons, and that's working and saving lives. Yeah, in that community, in those specific circumstances. I think we're in a mentality today in our society where we hear one solution that works somewhere, and we're like, oh, that sounds like a good idea. Here's the pretty shiny new pet. Let me grab that and put it on in action in my community. And that's not the answer. You've got to dig down. You got to dig deeper as to why they're doing something that way and answer the question, is that going to work in my community, or is there something I can do to fix the system?
Yeah. I concur.
Yeah, it is a good question, and it's a good question for spirited debate. And I think it's one that we have to have the conversation on both sides.
I've been asked numerous times about this. I've thought about it myself. It's like, what would I do? If I'm standing there looking at 3 people potentially dying in front of me, and I know there's an ambulance, I saw them drive in, just down the road. I could see them and park and wait. So I've had this question myself. So this has been very educational to me. We've talked about this before, but it's still educational. And you're right. We need to work together, and prepare the system and not just wing it on game day. And leadership, police chiefs, fire chiefs, EMS chiefs, emergency managers, city managers, county managers. You got to deal with these problems. You got to deal with these problems. Don't force your people who are working on the street, on the line, to have to clean up this mess and be making lemonade the day of an event when they knew 3 years ago that it was going to have this kind of outcome. That's crap. And that's a failure of leadership. So when your leaders, when your line people tell you they have concerns, take it seriously and do something about it. Get the dialogue started, and don't just drop it at, well, we're not going to support that. If your EMS agency literally says to you, we're not going to support that, we're not going to do RTFs, we're not going to go downrange, we'll transport your patients from a cold zone location. Okay, that's a terrible answer, but if that's the answer and nobody's going to throw down the trump card, then at least now as a
executive police leader, you know what you're dealing with. And now you can make decisions and design a system that's going to work.
Yep. Allen, Texas, they did that very thing in a mall shooting they had recently. They didn't think it was a warm enough zone where they had the shooting. So the officers moved them to ambulances off in a cold zone. So I don't think they planned that way, but it worked that way. So they probably have a plan now that in a similar situation will do the exact same thing. It worked this time, but they plan for it now. And I think that's a message we leave today from that simple question I thought I asked earlier.
Not that simple, brother.
It's not that simple. Is that, work through this ahead of time.
And the thing I would add to your plan is and practice.
Oh, there's that. Exercise.
Yeah, you've got to practice. You've got to give. We've said it I don't know how many times. You don't get to the Super Bowl by doing one practice. You get there by doing a lot of work, and this is no different than that.
Yeah. The gym, you don't bench press 200 pounds if you've never bench pressed 100 pounds.
Amen. If you do, you end up being one of those memes that are out there. Joe, any final thoughts?
No, I think we've had enough metaphors.
Metaphors or analogies? All right. Terry, any final thoughts?
I'm good. Thank you.
All right. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for tuning in. We hope you found this informative. If you have some thoughts or questions about it, shoot them to us. We're happy to have email and interaction with the listeners. You can send it to us at info@c3pathways.com. Again, that's info, INFO, at c3pathways.com. We'd like to thank our producer, Carla Torres, and until next time, stay safe.